Chapter 1. The Forgotten Daughter. My name is Madison Cole. I grew up watching my father build an empire that had no place for me. To him, I was the quiet one, the girl with ideas too soft for the world of men. On the night he celebrated 35 years of Cole Tech, he raised a glass to my brother's future and called me a dreamer. He didn't notice that I was already breaking. I smiled, applauded, and let the world believe I'd accepted my place. But what he didn't know was that every heartbreak he gave me became the blueprint for my revenge. 10 years later, I came back, not as his daughter, but as the woman who owned everything he built. The first thing I remember about that night was the sound of rain tapping against the tall glass windows of the ballroom. Boston in November always smelled like wet stone and old history, and that night it smelled like expectation too. My father's company, Coltech Systems, was celebrating 35 years of innovation. There were banners hanging from the ceiling, a live jazz trio near the bar, and a room full of people who all seemed to have one thing in common. They were there for Richard Cole. I stood by the edge of the crowd, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, pretending it was champagne. I had just graduated from MIT that summer, and my mother had insisted I come home for the celebration. She said my father would be proud to see me. I believed her, or maybe I wanted to. When my father spotted me, his smile was brief, polite, almost like I was one of the investors he needed to greet. He put a firm hand on my shoulder and said something to the man beside him. "This is my daughter Madison, just finished at MIT. Then he laughed. She inherited her mother's soft heart. It was the kind of sentence that sounded like a compliment to strangers, but felt like a bruise to me. My brother Grant arrived late, as usual. The moment he walked in, my father's face changed completely. He clapped him on the back, introduced him to everyone within reach, talked about his promotion to Vice President of Development. Grant soaked in every word like sunlight. My mother Evelyn appeared beside me and handed me a napkin when she saw my untouched drink. "He does love you, Maddie. He just doesn't know how to show it." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe he doesn't want to." The speeches began. My father took the stage and spoke about legacy and innovation. He told the story of how he built Coltech out of a single rented office in Cambridge, how every success was a result of perseverance, and how Grant was the next step in that evolution. When he said my brother's name, the room filled with applause. Then he looked in my direction and smiled that same careful smile. "And of course, my daughter Madison, the academic one. She'll find her way, I'm sure." People turned to look at me, smiling politely. I nodded and pretended it didn't sting. Later, when most of the guests had drifted toward the bar, I found him near the podium reviewing his note cards. I asked if I could have 5 minutes. He checked his watch but didn't say no. I told him I had an idea, something I'd been working on since my final semester at MIT, a system that could integrate data from multiple companies into one cohesive platform. I explained how it could revolutionize logistics, finance, healthcare, how it could even make Coltech's software more competitive. He listened for less than a minute before interrupting. "Madison, this company doesn't need another theory. We deal with real products, not academic fantasies." "It's not a fantasy," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It's scalable, efficient, and no one in our market is doing it yet." He shook his head. "You're smart, but you lack focus. You need experience, not big ideas. Start small, help your brother's team, learn how things really work." I felt the heat rise behind my eyes. "I don't want to work under Grant. I want to build something of my own." He sighed, like he'd heard this before. "That's the problem with your generation. You think success comes from passion, not patience." I looked around the ballroom, the gold lights, the people toasting his name, the giant banner that read 35 years of excellence. I realized nothing I said would ever be enough. When I turned to leave, he called after me, You can be part of this family's future, Madison, but not if you keep chasing dreams. Outside, the air was cold and wet. The rain soaked through my coat in seconds. I walked across the parking lot without an umbrella, heels slipping on the pavement. The city lights blurred in the puddles. My mother caught up to me near the car, breathless, her hair pinned back with silver clips. "Maddie, please, don't leave like this. He doesn't mean it. He always means it," I said. She looked at me with eyes full of something between guilt and hope. "You're stronger than he realizes. Prove it to him." I wanted to tell her that I wasn't doing this for him anymore, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I hugged her once, hard, and stepped away. The bus station was almost empty. I bought a one-way ticket to San Francisco, the farthest place I could think of that still felt like possibility. The clerk asked if I wanted a return. I said no. When the bus pulled out of the station, the city disappeared behind a fogged window. I rested my forehead against the glass and watched the streetlights smear into long, golden lines. In that moment, the sound of rain faded into the hum of the engine. I didn't know what waited for me 3,000 miles away. I didn't know how to build a company or even how to start one. But I knew one thing. I would never come back as the girl they pitied at the edge of a ballroom. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, barely audible over the rumble of the wheels, "One day, he will see what I became." Then I let the darkness outside take me, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest pull of freedom. Chapter 2. The years no one knew about San Francisco was nothing like Boston. The air tasted like salt and diesel, and the skyline at night looked more like possibility than home. I rented a room in a crumbling Victorian house near the Mission District, sharing a kitchen with two strangers who never learned my last name. During the day, I worked out of a garage that smelled like coffee, sweat, and soldered wires. There was no plan, only motion. The first two people who joined me were Alex and Priya, a pair of engineers fresh out of Stanford who still believed anything could be built with code and caffeine. We had 3 laptops, 2 folding tables, and one goal we didn't know how to describe yet. At night we'd sit on the floor, eating instant noodles, drawing diagrams on the concrete with chalk, mapping what we thought the future might look like. Money ran out faster than time. I freelanced on small data projects just to keep the lights on. Sometimes I would wake up at 2 in the morning, heart pounding, afraid I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I kept a photo of my father's last company speech on my phone, not because I missed him, but because I needed to remember what I was running from. Everything began to change. The afternoon I met Elaine Brooks, I was sitting in the back of a coffee shop on Market Street, trying to convince a potential investor that my platform could integrate real-time analytics across multiple systems. He listened for 5 minutes, said it sounded too risky, and left me with a cold espresso and a bruised ego. When I looked up, there was a woman watching me from the next table. Late 30s, sharp eyes, dark suit that looked expensive but worn too often. "You used to work at Cole Tech, didn't you?" she asked. My throat went dry. I didn't think anyone here would know my name. She smiled, not unkindly. "Relax. I'm not here to drag family ghosts into this. I used to be their CFO. Fired 2 years ago for telling your father he needed more women in leadership." I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. "He never mentioned you," I said. "He wouldn't," she replied. "He hates being reminded that people disagree with him." That was how Elaine became the first real ally I'd had since leaving home. She joined us unofficially at first, reviewing spreadsheets, teaching me how to set up contracts, and how to write clauses that protected founders from predatory investors. She was relentless, sometimes cold, but always fair. "You have ideas, Madison?" she said one night, tapping a pen against my business plan. "But ideas don't build empires. Structure does. You need something that looks legitimate, even if it's only smoke until the fire catches." She was the one who came up with the name Summit Integrations. It sounded ambitious, solid, inevitable. The second piece was Summit West Holdings, a shell company that would own the intellectual property on paper, keeping my name off everything tied to coal tech. Elaine said, anonymity was my strongest advantage. If Richard Cole ever finds out who you are, she warned, he'll shut every door in this city. I believed her. So, we built quietly, piece by piece. The garage became an office, then two. Clients started to trickle in, small logistics firms that couldn't afford the big players. I learned to negotiate, to pitch, to lead without showing fear. I worked 16-hour days, sometimes 20. There were nights I slept on the couch beside the server rack, lulled by the hum of fans and the glow of blue indicator lights. Alex and Priya grew into their roles, building prototypes that actually worked. We delivered our first project 6 months later. The client sent a check for $20,000, and I held it like it was a crown. Elaine opened a bottle of cheap champagne and poured it into paper cups. She raised hers. To ghosts, she said, the ones who refused to stay buried. Over the years, we reinvested every cent. I lived out of a suitcase, never buying anything I couldn't carry. We moved into a real office in Soma, glass walls, whiteboards filled with code and flowcharts. I stopped introducing myself as Madison Cole. To clients, I was M. Hayes, CEO of Summit Integrations. It was safer that way. By 2019, our systems were running in hospitals, banks, and shipping companies across 3 states. I watched from a distance as Coltech started to lose contracts. Slowly, quietly, they were still big, still respected, but the cracks were forming. Elaine would slide reports across my desk, showing which of their suppliers we'd quietly invested in through Summit West. It was never illegal, but it was strategic, like playing chess against a ghost who didn't know he was losing. One night, around midnight, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're becoming what he never believed you could be. Are you ready for what comes with that?" I looked at the screen showing our revenue graph, climbing higher each quarter. I didn't answer. Then came the contract that changed everything. A multinational logistics corporation, based in London, wanted a complete overhaul of their data integration system. The deal was worth $20 million. It would take nearly every ounce of our resources to deliver, but if we pulled it off, we'd be untouchable. The meeting was in a boardroom overlooking the Bay Bridge. The executives sat across from me, 3 men in tailored suits, polite but skeptical. I explained our framework, our scalability, how we could cut their processing time by 40%. One of them asked why a relatively unknown firm like Summit should be trusted with such a massive operation. I smiled, though my hands trembled under the table. "Because we build systems that last," I said, "not names that fade." They signed the Memorandum of Understanding that afternoon. When the final signature hit the page, I felt the same pulse I had on that night bus years ago. But this time, it wasn't freedom pulling me forward. It was power. Elaine found me later, standing by the window, staring at the bridge lights flickering in the fog. She placed a folder on the table beside me, full of the signed documents. "You did it," she said softly. "You're not a ghost anymore." "Maybe not," I replied, though part of me knew better. I wasn't visible yet. Not to him, not to the world that once turned its back on me, but I was close. That night, as I drove home along the Embarcadero, the city shimmered under mist and neon. I rolled down the window, breathing in the salt air, and whispered the words I hadn't dared to say aloud since the day I left Boston. "He'll see me one day, and when he does, he won't even recognize what I've become." Chapter 3. The door reopens. Boston looked smaller than I remembered. The skyline had changed, new towers rising beside the old ones, but the air felt the same. Cold, sharp, proud. 10 years had passed since I last walked those streets, yet every corner still carried his shadow. I arrived at Logan Airport under gray clouds, the kind that never quite clear. The driver who picked me up from the terminal asked if I was in town for business. I said yes, though the truth was heavier than that. Elaine met me at the hotel that afternoon. She was dressed in her usual dark suit, holding a folder filled with projections, contracts, and contingency plans. Summit Integrations had grown into a powerhouse, quietly acquiring companies across the country. But Cold Tech was the one that mattered. "This is it," she said as she spread the papers across the desk. "Cold Tech's numbers are worse than I expected. Declining market share, bloated payroll, lawsuits waiting to happen. If you hadn't stayed anonymous all these years, Richard would never even let you through the door." I stared at the old logo on the report, the same blue and silver crest I had grown up seeing on letterheads and coffee mugs. It looked tired now. "They need the investment," I said. "He'll listen because he's desperate." Elaine leaned closer. "Just remember what's at stake. If anyone in that boardroom realizes who you are, this deal collapses. He will shut it down out of pride, even if it kills the company." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. I had spent a decade preparing for this meeting, yet the thought of facing him again made my hands tremble. That evening, I drove to the house in Brookline. The same white columns, the same manicured hedges. My mother opened the door before I could knock. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She looked older, her hair silver at the temples, but her eyes were the same soft green. "Maddie?" she whispered, as if saying my name might make me disappear again. "Hi, Mom." She pulled me into her arms. I felt her shake, just slightly, before she stepped back. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "It's business," I said. "I'm here for meetings." Her smile faltered. "With your father?" "Yes." She looked down at her hands, then nodded. "He's not the same man you remember, but he's still proud. Try not to give him a reason to build another wall." Inside, the house smelled like cedar and lemon polish. My old photos were gone from the hallway. Only Grant's graduation portrait hung on the staircase wall. The next morning, Elaine and I walked into Cold Tech headquarters. The building felt colder than I expected, glass and steel reflecting nothing but sky. I wore a dark gray suit, hair pulled back, voice steady. The receptionist led us into the boardroom, where Richard sat flanked by two executives. Grant stood beside him, tall, confident, perfectly rehearsed. "Mr. Cole," I said as he extended his hand. "Madison Hayes, CEO of Summit Integrations. It's a pleasure." He studied me for a moment before shaking my hand. His grip was firm, professional, impersonal. "Hayes, you run the integration firm out of San Francisco. I've heard of you." I smiled. "That's good to hear. We've been following Coltech's growth for a while. We believe we can help accelerate your recovery." He arched an eyebrow. "Recovery implies something's broken." Grant cut in. "Our numbers are strong. Market fluctuations are temporary." Elaine placed a folder in front of him. "These are the financial reports from the last 2 quarters. Loss margins, vendor attrition, deferred payments. If this trend continues, your capital reserves will drop below sustainable levels by next summer." Grant frowned. "Where did you get these figures?" "Public filings," she said smoothly. "You might want to review them more closely before assuming the market is to blame." For the next hour, we presented slides, projections, and a restructuring plan. Richard listened without expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. Every few minutes he glanced at me, as if trying to place a memory he couldn't name. Finally, he spoke. "What exactly does Summit get out of this partnership?" "Equity," I said. "We're offering an infusion of capital in exchange for controlling interest. 51%. Grant nearly laughed. "That's a takeover, not a partnership." "It's a lifeline," Elaine replied. "Without new capital, Cold Tech will fold within 2 years. The room went silent. Richard leaned back, eyes on me. And you think you can run my company better than I can? I met his gaze without flinching. I think your company deserves a future. He didn't answer. He turned to Grant. Schedule a second review. I'll think about it. After the meeting, Elaine and I walked out into the crisp afternoon air. She lit a cigarette and exhaled toward the sky. That went better than I expected, she said. He doesn't trust me yet, I replied. He's still looking for the angle. He's always looking, she said. But the numbers don't lie. That night, back at the hotel, Elaine received a call from our internal compliance officer. Someone from Coltech's accounting department had been digging through ownership records linked to Summit West Holdings. It was close, too close. If that leak connects the dots, she said quietly, this whole thing unravels. Do we know who it is? Not yet, but we will. I barely slept. Memories of the last time I'd stood in front of my father replayed in flashes, his voice telling me I was unfocused, his hand pushing away my ideas. The next morning, we were summoned back to the office. Richard was waiting alone in the boardroom. He looked tired. The arrogance I remembered had softened into something like exhaustion. I reviewed your proposal, he said. My son disagrees, of course. He thinks we can recover without outside help. And what do you think? I asked. He gave a small, humorless smile. I think survival matters more than pride. He picked up the pen, hesitated, then signed the document transferring 51% of Coltech's shares to Summit Integrations. I watched the ink dry on the page, the same name that once dismissed me now undermined. He handed me the folder without looking up. You have your investment, Miss Hayes. I hope you know what you're doing. I took the papers, forcing my hands to stay steady. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I believe I do. As I walked out of that room, sunlight broke through the clouds outside the glass wall, scattering reflections across the floor. For the first time, the building no longer felt like his kingdom. In my head, the voice I had carried for 10 years whispered, almost softly, for the first time, I held power in the world he built. Chapter 4. Thanksgiving Dinner. The leaves in Brookline had already turned, red and gold scattered across the old stone driveway. The house looked the same as the night I left, the same shutters, the same tall windows, as if time had politely waited for my return. My mother called 2 weeks earlier, her voice trembling with hope. Just one dinner, Maddie. Thanksgiving. He wants the family together again. I had every reason to refuse, but something in her voice, fragile and pleading, made it impossible. So there I was, walking up those marble steps again, dressed in quiet gray, the kind of neutral armor people wear when they plan to survive the night. Evelyn opened the door before I could knock. She looked both relieved and terrified, as if she half expected me to vanish if she blinked. You came, she said, her smile thin but real. I promised her I'd only stay for dinner, nothing more. The house smelled like rosemary and roasted turkey. I followed her down the hallway, past the family photos that hadn't changed in a decade. Grant's face stared back from every wall, younger, confident, immortalized in perfect lighting. My pictures were gone. I pretended not to notice. Sienna appeared in the doorway of the living room, a phone in her hand and a glass of wine in the other. She wore a gold dress that shimmered when she moved. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence, the runaway genius. I smiled lightly. Still dramatic, I see. Always, she said, taking a sip. Someone has to make this house interesting. Grant entered behind her, wearing a dark suit like he was heading to a board meeting instead of dinner. He looked older but not wiser, his confidence polished to arrogance. I heard you've been busy, he said. Summit Integrations, right? Quite the success story. I suppose some people land on their feet, some people build their own ground, I replied. Before he could respond, our father's voice filled the room. Richard stood at the top of the staircase, every inch the patriarch he'd always wanted to be. When his eyes met mine, he hesitated for just a second before offering a thin smile. Madison, it's been a long time. 10 years, I said. He nodded as if that number didn't matter. Come in. Dinner's ready. The dining room looked like it belonged in a magazine, silverware gleaming, candles reflecting in the glass. My mother had outdone herself, as if perfection could hold the family together. We took our seats, the clinking of cutlery echoing louder than any conversation. Richard raised his glass. I'm grateful we're all here tonight. It's been too long since this family sat together. Sienna murmured something about miracles. Grant smirked. I stayed silent. Then Richard continued, his voice rising with pride. I have news. Cole Tech has officially entered a new era. I've sold controlling interest to Summit Integrations, a strategic partnership that will ensure the company's future. And, to honor our legacy, I'm establishing the Cole Tech Foundation for Technology Education. Evelyn smiled nervously. That's wonderful, Richard. Truly. Grant slammed his fork down. You did what? You sold the company? Sienna gasped, her wine glass tilting dangerously. You can't be serious. That's our inheritance. Richard looked at them, unbothered. It's my decision. The company needed stability, and Summit Integrations offered the best path forward. Grant's face reddened. You sold us out to strangers. Do you have any idea what that means for the board, for the family name? It means security, Richard said firmly. And legacy. You'll understand one day when you learn to think beyond yourself. The room went still. I could feel the air tightening, the tension wrapping around us like thread ready to snap. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes darting between us, praying the storm would pass. Richard turned toward me, still unaware, still blind to the truth. The CEO behind Summit Integrations is someone I deeply admire. Sharp, strategic, forward-thinking, the kind of leader this generation needs. Grant scoffed. Another tech prodigy with no loyalty to tradition, I'm sure. My heart pounded, but my voice came out steady. Actually, she has more loyalty to this family than you'll ever know. They all turned to look at me. I stood slowly, every breath deliberate. Richard frowned. What do you mean by that? I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who once told me to stop dreaming, who taught me that love had to be earned through obedience. My hands didn't shake when I said it. The CEO you admire, the one who owns Coltech now, is me. The sound that followed wasn't silence. It was the sharp inhale of disbelief, the scrape of a chair against marble, the crash of a glass as Grant's hand trembled and lost control. Sienna's mouth opened, but no words came. My mother covered her lips, eyes wide, tears forming. Richard stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. That's impossible. It isn't, I said calmly. The deal is legal. Every share, every document, every signature. The company belongs to Summit Integrations, and I am Summit Integrations. His face turned pale. You manipulated me. No, I gave you what you wanted, survival. You just never asked who was saving you. Grant's voice rose, furious. You can't do this to us. You think money gives you the right to destroy everything he built? I met his eyes. I didn't destroy it. I rebuilt it. You were too busy spending your inheritance to notice it was falling apart. He took a step toward me, but my mother's voice cut through the tension. Enough, please. Her plea hung in the air, trembling. Richard pushed back his chair, his jaw tightened, his eyes filled with something between rage and disbelief. You humiliated me, he said. You used my weakness against me. I didn't want revenge, I said softly. I wanted respect. You left me no other way to earn it. He turned, gripping the edge of the table, as if the world had tilted beneath him. Then he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall until they faded. Sienna sat frozen, staring at her reflection in the wine glass. Grant stormed after our father, muttering curses under his breath. My mother reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched mine. "Maddie, what have you done?" I looked down at the untouched plate in front of me, the candles flickering, the smell of turkey and tension heavy in the air. "What I had to," I said. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow and silent against the window pane. Inside, the house felt colder than it ever had before. Chapter 5. The Truth Behind Charity. The morning after Thanksgiving, Boston was quiet. Snow had settled overnight, softening the streets, covering everything in a thin white layer that looked peaceful only from a distance. I packed my suitcase at the hotel, folded my suit jacket, and told myself that what happened at dinner was the ending I had come for. The company was mine. The truth was out. There was nothing left to say. A knock came at the door just as I zipped the bag. When I opened it, my mother was standing there, cheeks red from the cold, clutching a folder wrapped in her scarf. She looked tired, the way people do when they've been crying but won't admit it. "You weren't going to say goodbye," she said. "I thought it would be easier this way." "For who?" she asked softly. "You or him?" I stepped aside and let her in. She placed the folder on the table and stared at it for a moment before speaking. "He's not just selling the company, Maddie. He's hiding something." My chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" She opened the folder, her hands shaking. Inside were printed contracts, invoices, transfers. The letterhead read Cole Tech Foundation. It looked official, polished, perfectly legal. But when I started reading, the numbers didn't make sense. There were payments to shell companies, donations that looped back into accounts under different names. "He said it was for education," she whispered. "Scholarships, training programs, but these payments don't go anywhere real." I flipped through the pages. The same contractors appeared under multiple aliases, all registered to the same post office box in Chicago. Grant's name showed up in the authorization line. My father's signature was below it. I looked up at her. "Does he know?" She hesitated. "He knows enough to look away." I sank into the chair. My throat felt dry. If I expose this, he loses everything. His name, his legacy, the company, all of it. My mother's voice cracked. "If you don't, you lose yourself." She left the folder on the table and turned to the window. The snow outside had begun to melt into slush, gray and heavy. "He loved you in his own way," she said quietly. "But loving someone doesn't make them right." When she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers. Every page felt heavier than the last. I thought about the dinner, the look on his face when I told him the truth. I thought I had already taken everything from him. I hadn't. That evening, I called Elaine. She answered on the first ring. "I need you to see something," I said. She arrived 20 minutes later, coat dusted with snow, eyes sharp as always. I handed her the folder. She flipped through it quickly, lips pressed together. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. "This isn't just bad accounting, Madison. This is criminal." "I know. Grant's name is all over it. And your father's signature." I nodded. "He either helped or ignored it. I don't know which is worse." Elaine sat back. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. If I go public, it'll destroy him." She studied me for a long moment, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "Truth doesn't destroy people. Lies do." Her words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't answer. She gathered the papers and tucked them into her briefcase. "I'll handle it," she said. "Elaine, don't. It's already in motion," she said, standing. "You built a company on transparency. Don't start protecting the very corruption you walked away from." When she left, the room felt smaller. I stared at the door long after it closed. 2 days later, I was sitting in the airport lounge, waiting for my flight back to San Francisco. The television above the bar was muted, showing a news broadcast. I wasn't paying attention until I saw my father's face flash across the screen. The headline read, Patriarch of Coal Tech Under Investigation. My heart stopped. I asked the bartender to turn up the volume. The reporter was standing in front of Coal Tech headquarters, microphone in hand. Authorities are investigating allegations of financial misconduct involving the Coal Tech Foundation. Sources claim the organization was used to funnel corporate funds through shell companies connected to family members. The camera cut to a live shot outside the building. Richard Cole was surrounded by reporters, microphones pushing toward his face as he tried to move through the crowd. His security guard guided him toward a waiting car, but the questions kept coming. Miss Cole, did you authorize the transfers? Is the foundation a front? Did you know your son was involved? He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his face pale, his expression blank. I couldn't breathe. Elaine's voice echoed in my head, calm, unwavering. Truth doesn't destroy people. Lies do. The news anchor continued, saying the story had originated from leaked internal documents. I didn't have to ask who leaked them. I knew. When I arrived back at the hotel, I called Elaine. She picked up on the second ring. You leaked it, I said. Yes. You should have told me. You would have stopped me. He's my father, Elaine. And you're his daughter, she said quietly. That's why he'll survive this. The truth is only fatal to people who keep running from it. I didn't reply. She didn't apologize. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with the television still on. They were replaying the same footage of my father, trapped between cameras and microphones, his reputation collapsing in real time. I watched it again and again until the images blurred. Somewhere between anger and pity, I realized I didn't know which I felt more. I turned off the TV and stared at the dark window. Outside, the snow had started falling again, light and steady. For the first time, I wondered if victory could ever feel like peace. Chapter 6. When Justice Knocks. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Summit's San Francisco office. A folded document stamped with the seal of the Massachusetts Business Court. I knew before opening it what it meant. Richard Cole was challenging the validity of the Summit acquisition, claiming coercion, deceit, and conflict of interest. I stared at my name printed on the second page, the one that said, Defendant, and felt the weight of every choice I had made settle in my chest. Elaine walked into my office a few minutes later, holding her own copy. Her expression was unreadable. He's coming after you, she said. He's not going down quietly. He never does. She closed the door and sat across from me. We'll fight this, but you need to be ready for everything to come out in that courtroom. Every document, every connection, every decision. I nodded. I had expected this. I just hadn't expected it to hurt. 2 weeks later, I was back in Boston. The courthouse stood gray and imposing against the winter sky, a place where truth and ego collided under fluorescent lights. The press waited outside, cameras flashing as we walked through the doors. I kept my eyes down. Elaine walked beside me, calm, collected, the steady rhythm to my storm. Inside, the air smelled like paper and polish. Judge Karen Whitmore presided, a woman in her late 50s, with a clear voice and a gaze that could slice through excuses. On one side of the room sat Richard and his legal team. Grant sat behind him, jaw tight, avoiding my eyes. Evelyn was in the row behind me, hands clasped around a rosary she no longer believed in. The proceedings began with statements. Richard's attorney spoke first, painting a picture of manipulation, betrayal, and familial exploitation. According to him, I had preyed on my father's vulnerability, using false pretenses to seize control of his life's work. When he finished, my name hung in the air like an accusation no one could breathe through. Elaine rose for our response. Her voice was steady, almost surgical. She walked through every financial report, every signed contract, every proof of due process. The purchase had been legal, transparent, and properly documented. The issue, she said, was not deception but accountability. Then came the part I had been dreading. The foundation records. Elaine handed them to the clerk and began reading excerpts aloud. Payments routed through dummy corporations, signatures that linked back to Grant. The courtroom murmured as each page turned. Grant shifted in his seat, his face pale. The judge looked up. Mr. Cole, do you wish to respond to these documents? He hesitated, glancing at his father. Richard gave no sign, staring straight ahead. Grant swallowed hard. I can't, he said quietly. They're real. A silence followed, sharp and absolute. Richard's lawyer rose. These transactions were the result of mismanagement by junior staff. My client had no knowledge of their existence. Evelyn stood suddenly from the audience, voice trembling but firm. That's a lie. He knew. I showed him the documents myself. He told me to destroy them. The judge motioned for her to sit, but the damage was done. The air in the room changed. Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, almost weary. I never approved criminal activity. I acted in the company's best interest. Elaine stepped forward. Mr. Cole, was it in the company's best interest to allow your son to steal from it? He glared at her. You wouldn't understand. This was family. Elaine didn't flinch. Family doesn't exempt you from the law. The judge interjected, asking for clarification on several documents. The back and forth lasted hours, numbers and signatures blurring into a rhythm of denial and proof. My pulse never slowed. I kept my eyes on the wood grain of the table, on the steady movement of the clerk's pen, on anything but his face. Then Richard's attorney turned his focus on me. Miss Cole, or should I say, Miss Hayes, you concealed your identity during negotiations. You exploited your father's trust. Tell this court, did you buy Cole Tech out of justice or revenge? The room went silent. I could feel every eye on me, waiting. I stood slowly, my palms flat on the table. This isn't revenge, I said. It's restoration. I didn't take what wasn't mine. I took responsibility for what he refused to protect. The truth belongs where it should. The lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge raised her hand. Enough. She reviewed the final exhibits, her expression unreadable. The tension in the courtroom was heavy enough to press against the skin. Finally, she set her glasses down and looked directly at us. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, she said, this court finds that the acquisition of Coltech systems by Summit Integrations was conducted legally and transparently. The contract stands. Coltech is, by law, property of Summit Integrations. She turned toward Richard and Grant. As for the financial misconduct regarding the Coltech Foundation, that will be subject to a separate criminal inquiry. Each party bears its own accountability. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound echoed like closure. For a long time, no one moved. Reporters began to whisper, pens scratching across notepads. Richard sat still, his eyes hollow. Grant stared at the floor. Evelyn's hand covered her mouth, as if she couldn't decide whether to cry or pray. Elaine touched my arm. You won, she said quietly. I didn't feel like I had. When we stepped outside, the crowd of journalists surged forward, shouting questions I couldn't hear. Flashbulbs burst like lightning. The cold air hit my face, sharp enough to sting. Across the street, my father was climbing into a waiting car. For a moment, he looked back, our eyes meeting through the blur of cameras and snow. There was no anger there, no recognition of victory or defeat. Only something quieter, something that looked like loss. Elaine called for the driver, and I followed her into the car. As the city blurred past the window, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Justice had come, not with triumph, but with silence, And in that silence, I understood that winning and losing weren't opposites. Sometimes they were the same thing, wearing different names. Chapter 7. Unexpected Redemption. The weeks after the hearing moved slowly, like the city was holding its breath. Snow covered Boston again, quieting everything it touched. The media storm refused to fade, though I refused to speak. Every morning, new headlines filled the papers, analyzing the case, the family, the downfall of a name once synonymous with innovation. Elaine told me that silence was the right choice, that the truth would speak louder than any statement. I wasn't sure it would. I stayed in a rented apartment near the waterfront, a small place with a view of the harbor and just enough space to think. Invitations for interviews came daily, some from national outlets, some from magazines eager to brand me as the woman who beat her father at his own game. I deleted every email, turned down every call. The idea of becoming someone's headline made me sick. One morning, I turned on the television by mistake, forgetting I had left it on the news channel. Richard's face filled the screen, caught by a reporter outside his townhouse in Beacon Hill. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the scandal had hollowed him out. He ignored the questions, pushing past the cameras without a word. The caption beneath his image read, "Former Coal Tech founder retreats from public life." Elaine called later that day. "He's not speaking to anyone," she said. "Not even Grant." "That doesn't surprise me. Evelyn visited him last week. She said he barely opened the door." I hesitated. "Is she okay?" "She's worried about both of you," Elaine said. "You should call her." I promised I would, but I didn't. Days passed. I buried myself in work, reviewing Summit's restructuring plan for what was now officially Summit Coal Technologies. The new name felt strange, both familiar and foreign. We had kept part of his legacy, not as an act of mercy but as a bridge. Maybe some things didn't have to be erased to be rebuilt. One evening, while the city slept under another snowfall, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "He's sick, Maddie, not physically, just lost. I know you think it's too late, but please see him. Not for him, for yourself." I didn't respond immediately. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then I put the phone down and went to the window. The harbor lights flickered across the frozen water. Somewhere beneath the ice, the tide was still moving. The next morning, I drove to Beacon Hill. His townhouse stood at the end of a narrow street, brick walls half covered in ivy, the same house I had visited as a child, when he still smiled at me like the world was ours to share. Now, the curtains were drawn tight. I knocked twice before hearing footsteps. When the door opened, Richard stood there, thinner than I remembered, his gray hair uncombed, his expression caught between pride and exhaustion. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Maybe not, but I'm here." He stepped aside, wordless. The living room was dim, filled with papers and unopened mail. The television played quietly in the background, muted. He sat down in his chair, the same leather one he used to read in when I was little. "You've done well for yourself," he said finally. "The company looks stronger than it's been in years." "It's doing fine," I said. "The team has been good to me." He nodded slowly. "I didn't think you'd keep the name." "It's part of what we built," I said. "I didn't want to erase that." He gave a dry laugh, more breath than sound. "You mean what I built?" I didn't answer. He stared at the floor for a long time, then spoke again. "You were right, you know, about everything, about the company, about me. I spent so long convincing myself that strength meant control. I didn't realize real strength was the thing I tried to crush out of you." I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed still. "I thought I was protecting this family," he continued. "But all I did was make sure no one could reach me. You were the only one who ever tried. I just didn't see it until too late." He looked up then, his eyes sharp despite the tiredness. I can't ask for forgiveness. I shook my head. I don't need forgiveness, Dad, just acknowledgement. The silence between us softened. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he said something I never thought I'd hear from him. I'm proud of you, Madison. You became everything I couldn't be. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, letting the words find a place to land. When I left, Evelyn was waiting outside in her car. She rolled down the window, relief flickering across her face. You saw him. Yes. She smiled faintly. He needed that. So did you. Grant came by the office a few days later, unannounced. He stood in the doorway, awkward, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. I didn't expect him to look so uncertain. I came to say sorry, he said, for everything. The money, the lies, all of it. I was stupid. I thought power was something you inherited. Turns out it's something you have to deserve. I looked at him, unsure how to answer. You'll figure it out, I said. Just start doing things that matter. He smiled, almost like we used to before the years turned us into strangers. I will. Sienna's helping me. Sienna? He nodded. She wants to represent the family. Be the face of the new brand. She's good at it, surprisingly. The press loves her. That didn't surprise me. Sienna had always known how to turn chaos into a spotlight. When he left, I stood by the window and looked across the city. The sun was setting, streaking the skyline in orange and gold. From where I stood, I could see the new sign on the building across the river, Summit Coal Technologies. The letters glowed softly in the fading light. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, no ache, just quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally spent itself. I stayed there until the lights of the city blurred into the glass, until my reflection disappeared into the view. Then I whispered the words that came without effort, words that finally felt true. It's enough. Chapter 8. Success Isn't Revenge. The sun rose over the bay like it always did, soft and gold against the glass towers of San Francisco. The fog was thinner that morning, a rare gift, revealing the city beneath it in perfect clarity. It had been 12 years since the night I left Boston, 12 years since the rain and the bus ride and the promise I made to myself. I no longer felt the weight of proving anything. All I wanted now was to build something that mattered. Summit Coal Technologies had become everything I once dreamed it could be. The offices overlooked the Embarcadero, sunlight pouring through wide windows, the hum of conversation filling the air with life. There were no marble walls, no portraits of power, only open doors and people who believed in what we were building. Elaine walked into my office holding 2 mugs of coffee. She was grayer now, a little softer around the eyes, but sharper than ever. I looked up from the stack of proposals on my desk. You still make it better than anyone, I said. She smiled. Old habits. Besides, today's a big day. She was right. We were launching the Summit Women in Tech Fund, a project we had planned for over a year. It wasn't about competition or empire anymore. It was about opportunity. Scholarships, mentorships, startup grants for women who might have never been given a chance. Reporters were already waiting in the conference hall downstairs. The press release called it a step forward for equity and innovation. For me, it was something quieter, more personal. A way to close the loop on everything that began in that ballroom so long ago. Evelyn arrived later that morning. She had moved to the West Coast a few months earlier, saying she wanted to be closer to me, but I knew she also wanted to start over somewhere that didn't carry his shadow. She greeted the staff with warmth, her confidence subtle but commanding. You look happy, she said as we walked down the corridor together. I am, I said. Finally. She smiled, that knowing mother's smile that said she had seen every version of me, the one that broke and the one that rebuilt. The launch went smoothly, cameras flashed, microphones caught my words, but I spoke simply, keeping the speech brief. I told the story not of revenge, but of resilience, of how failure can be the beginning of something stronger. I talked about the women who would come after us, who deserved a world where their worth didn't have to be proven to be seen. When it ended, the applause was quiet at first, then grew louder, not out of spectacle but sincerity. Elaine stood near the back, her eyes bright. Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder as I stepped away from the podium. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," I corrected. That afternoon, I sat in my office overlooking the bay, the skyline reflected in the glass. The city had changed, but so had I. The girl who once ran from her father's world was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that peace wasn't the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. Harper, my young assistant, knocked gently and stepped inside with a notebook in hand. She was fresh out of college, eager, full of questions, the kind of woman this fund was made for. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "For you. Always." She sat across from me, nervous but determined. "I wanted to ask something," she said. "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm after everything?" I smiled. "I've learned that anger burns too fast. It leaves you empty before you even realize you've lost the fire. So you don't believe in revenge?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said. "Revenge is just noise. It feeds your pride, not your peace. Never waste energy on revenge, Harper. Sometimes silence and success are the only answers you need." She wrote it down like it was a lesson, but I could see in her eyes that she understood. She thanked me and left the office, her footsteps light in the hallway. When she was gone, I turned back to the window. Across the bay, the late afternoon light shimmered on the water. The world kept moving, the tide shifting like time itself. Somewhere in Boston, the house in Brookline still stood. I didn't know if my father ever walked past the building with our shared name on it. I didn't need to know. Elaine sent me a message later that evening. The first round of applications for the fund had already come in. I opened the file and saw names from every corner of the country. Each one carrying a story, each one a version of who I once was. I leaned back in my chair and felt something I hadn't in years: stillness. The city lights began to glow as night settled. Outside, people hurried through the streets, cars hummed along the bridge, and the air smelled faintly of salt and rain. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the quiet. The reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized, not because she had changed too much, but because she had finally become who she was meant to be. If someone once underestimated you, let success speak for you, then let it fall silent again.